Chicago is one of those places that, even if you don't know it, you've seen in a movie. The skyline reflected in Lake Michigan, the huge silver sculpture in Millennium Park, the one that looks like a giant bean and has become an obligatory selfie spot. The deep dish pizza arriving at the table, the icy winds hitting your face. It's all part of the imagination. No wonder the city has earned the nickname Windy City. In summer, the waterfront is packed with cyclists. In winter, the Chicago River, the river that runs through the city, is dyed green on St. Patrick's Day. There's art, architecture, jazz, blues, sports, a pulsating energy, and that cosmopolitan vibe typical of big cities in the United States. But behind the glitz, there's another side, much less touristy. Because Chicago is also made up of factories, debt, mafia, inequality, forgotten neighborhoods, and stories that few people tell. And that's why, today, Bello Mundo is going to take you on a guided tour of Chicago's dark side in a light, curious way, the way you already know it. Number 1. The Enchanting Postcard. Before diving into the darkness, it's worth remembering why Chicago enchants so many people right from the start. The city knows how to sell its image. In summer, the Riverwalk is packed with people strolling along the river. At the end of the year, the lights on the Magnificent Mile, the city's most famous avenue, set the mood for a Christmas movie. The Art Institute houses one of the most important collections in the world. The Field Museum has life-size Tyrannosaurus skeletons on display, and Lake Michigan even has an urban beach. When it comes to food, Chicago is a festival in itself. Hot dogs without ketchup, Italian beef sandwiches dipped in sauce, brownies, which were created here, and of course, the famous deep dish pizza with a high edge and lots of cheese. The city also shines in sports. There's basketball at the United Center, home of the Bulls, baseball with the Cubs in the north and the White Sox in the south, as well as American soccer with the Bears, playing in the freezing cold that leaves even the fans shivering. And the cityscape is pure postcard. Suspended trains skirting old buildings, bridges that open up to tourist boats, and, from the lookout points, a horizon that seems to have no end. It all seems perfect, until you turn the corner and see the part of the city that doesn't appear in the tourist brochures. Number 2. From factories to breaking ground. At the end of the 19th century, Chicago was seen as the workshop of the world. It was there that the giant slaughterhouses of the Union stockyards put the city on the global map. Tons of meat left daily in refrigerated wagons, feeding a growing country. Along with the meat industry came the steel factories, the heavy machinery workshops, the railroad lines, the grain warehouses, the shipyards. Everything was spinning, everything smoked, everything was producing. Polish, Irish, German, Italian, African-American immigrants from the segregated South of the United States. All were attracted by the promise of work and steady pay. It was hard, dirty, and dangerous, but it paid for bread on the table, and, more than that, it guaranteed dignity. Between 1880 and 1940, Chicago grew from less than 300,000 to more than 3.5 million inhabitants. It was the time of the meat barons, the freight trains crossing working-class neighborhoods, the improvised jazz in the alleys of Bronzeville, and the breweries that simmered in brick basements. But, as happened in many American industrial cities, the dream began to fall apart in the 60s. Automation arrived, factories moved from state to country. The big companies looked for cheaper labor, first in the south of the United States, then in Asia. Deindustrialization swept through Chicago like a cold wind off the lake. From one day to the next, experienced workers found themselves out of a job. Neighborhoods once teeming with life, such as South Chicago and Pullman, began to wither. Houses lost value, warehouses became empty, merchants closed their doors, and the young people who grew up watching their parents leave early for work began to grow up without this reference to the future. It wasn't just the concrete that collapsed, it was the sense of belonging. The collapse was economic, but also emotional. To this day, many people in these neighborhoods carry this loss in their bodies, in their shabby houses, in the silence of the block that was once a factory, a bar, a bakery, and a queue at the bus stop. Chicago has changed, but in some places, it seems that the clock stopped at the last whistle of the factory siren. Number 3. Gun violence. When it comes to violence, Chicago has a paradox that's hard to swallow. While the city center receives smiling tourists taking pictures, it only takes a few blocks to the south or west for the reality to change completely. There, the sound that dominates is not music, but gunfire. In 2023, the city recorded around 617 homicides and more than 2,400 shootings. Has it ever been worse? Certainly. But even so, Chicago was at the top of the national ranking for absolute numbers of deaths for 12 years in a row. The following year, 2024, the data showed a slight drop, approximately 572 murders. But this hasn't changed the routine in neighborhoods where children grow up hearing gunshots in the background. And what's more serious? This has a color, a zip code, a social class. Researchers from the University of Chicago have shown that residents of Black communities are 22 times more likely to be shot than whites from wealthy neighborhoods. It's inequality turned into statistics. In practice, this means children are learning to differentiate between fireworks and gunfire before they've even learned their multiplication tables. Number 4. Gangs and the drug market. Since the days of Al Capone, the one in the movies, a crime boss in the 1920s during Prohibition, Chicago has had a reputation as a gangster town. Today, the scene is different, but gangs still rule much of the city. Names like Gangster Disciples, Vice Lords, and Black P-Stones are still active, controlling entire city blocks. Only now the merchandise has changed. Instead of smuggled whiskey, the focus is on cocaine, heroin, and, above all, fentanyl, a synthetic opioid so potent that it has become one of the main culprits in the explosion of overdoses in the United States. And the impact of this can be seen in the figures. According to the police, more than 1 in 5 murders recorded in 2023 had a direct link to gang activity. Gangster Disciples itself, for example, still makes the headlines, with federal prosecutions for extortion, trafficking, and violence. Trafficking takes advantage of the city's structure. The expressways that cut through Chicago allow drugs to leave the suburbs and reach downtown in minutes. As a result, viaducts become delivery corridors, and many neighborhoods become zones of silent dispute. And as the police have learned to track large shipments, the groups split up into smaller cells, making investigations even more difficult. The result? Sporadic shootings in the middle of the afternoon, convenience stores surrounded by bars, and cameras installed everywhere, even on the roofs of houses. In some streets, drug trafficking has become, in practice, the most stable occupation available. And this feeds a heavy cycle of poverty and violence, which the city is unable or unwilling to resolve. Number 5. Segregation and poverty that don't fit on the map. Few cities in the United States have such visible divisions as Chicago. And we're not just talking about different neighborhoods, we're talking about completely different lives separated by a few kilometers. Studies show that Chicago is one of the most racially and economically segregated cities in the country. And that's no figure of speech. There's a map to prove it. Want an example? People who live in Streeterville, a chic neighborhood on the shores of Lake Michigan, tend to live more than 80 years. In Englewood, less than 30 minutes away, life expectancy barely reaches 60. Poverty affects around 17% of the city's population, but in areas of the South Side, the figure easily exceeds 50%. And it's not just a question of income. Schools in these neighborhoods receive less private investment, have fewer experienced teachers, and students often have to cross gang-dominated areas just to get to class. This chasm was dug over decades by practices such as redlining, a racist policy where banks denied credit to black families, preventing them from buying homes in certain areas. The result? Entire neighborhoods were excluded from any investment. Today, that past still knocks at the door, in the form of leaking roofs, broken sidewalks, crowded health centers, and buses that don't pass. Number 6. The black hole of pensions and the fiscal crisis. Today, the city has accumulated a debt of more than $51 billion in pensions alone, more than the liabilities of 43 entire American states. In practice, this means that the owner of the bakery, the sales clerk, the nurse, everyone who pays taxes, is helping to cover pensions that were signed away decades ago. And you know what's worse? In an attempt to contain the shortfall, taxes have been raised, to no avail. Even with the tax increase, the annual budget already starts with a shortfall of almost $1 billion. In recent years, the City Council has tried everything. It's turned off street lights, postponed car repairs, and closed the library on Sundays. Chicago today lives on a knife edge. If it pays pensions, it lacks money for basic services. If the funds are delayed, there's a legal bomb. The account simply won't close, and neither does the patience of those who live there. Number 7. Residents fleeing. With violence on the rise and taxes only going up, many people are leaving. According to U.S. Census estimates, Chicago has lost more than 128,000 inhabitants since 2014, the lowest number of residents since the 1920s. For many people, the bill no longer adds up. Expensive rent, bad schools, high gas prices, and police who are slow to arrive. The result? Those who can take to the road and seek a safer and cheaper life in another state. But this mass exodus comes at a price. Fewer people living there means less tax coming in, and the expensive infrastructure is still there. Sewage, refuse collection, lighting, street maintenance. The red brick houses, typical of many neighborhoods in the city, fall in price, become the target of speculators, or simply end up abandoned. And when this happens, vacant lots appear, empty spaces that end up attracting crime and urban decay. It's like Chicago is slowly losing blood. It doesn't kill all at once, but it weakens everything inside: commerce, housing, public services. And what's left for those who remain is an increasingly fragile system, trying to sustain itself on a base that keeps shrinking. Number 8. Police in check, cracked confidence. To make matters worse, the relationship between the population and the police is also in ruins. Since the case of Laquan McDonald, a young black man shot 16 times by a police officer in 2014, trust between the community and the authorities has all but disappeared. The episode was so serious that the Department of Justice stepped in, demanding profound changes: a review of the use of force, training against racial bias, more transparency in data. But years later, an independent report showed that less than a fifth of these goals had been met. City Hall says it lacks the funds to train everyone. Community groups, on the other hand, say that the police are purposely stonewalling. Meanwhile, South Side residents say they avoid calling the police for fear of retaliation or neglect. In many areas, the waiting time for non-emergency assistance can reach an hour. On the other side, officers complain of long shifts, crowded courts, and a lack of structure to investigate. The result is this hole. In certain neighborhoods, the police are a constant and suffocating presence. In others, they simply don't show up. To make matters even more complicated, there has even been a threat to cut the budget of the office responsible for the renovations, which could halt any progress. In this way, residents distrust the police say they've been abandoned, and the city continues in this game of push and pull, with no solution in sight. Number 9. Public services in crisis. With almost zero cash flow, Chicago is full of cracks in the asphalt, in the bills, and in the people's patience. The public school system is already forecasting a deficit of almost $1 billion for the next school year. This translates into crowded classes, closed libraries, and teachers scrambling to buy materials. There are streets that go dark for days because the utility company is waiting for a late payment. There are neighborhood hospitals with ambulance lines at dawn, no beds, no medicine, and no staff. And even though services are going from bad to worse, taxes are only going up. In some of the poorer districts, the tax revaluation has caused the amount to skyrocket, as in the case of residents in the south of the city, who have seen their bill rise by more than 3,000%. For many people, this means choosing between paying the bill or buying medicine. And when the city charges more and more and delivers less and less, the result is predictable. Middle-class people packing up and leaving. One more time. Number 10. Rebirth attempts. Of course, Chicago doesn't give up easily. The city is trying to reinvent itself. It has revitalized the river, freed casinos, and become home to startups, attracted by lower rents than those on the East Coast. There are young people starting businesses in old warehouses, community gardens springing up in vacant lots, and cultural events occupying forgotten squares. The mayor talks about sewing up the social fabric with employment programs for teenagers and actions against fentanyl addiction. But all this still looks like a patch, while the bigger hole remains: violence, debt, and segregation. While tourists line up to try the famous deep dish pizza, there are residents counting their steps to cross the street without hearing a gunshot. Chicago still has a creative soul, avant-garde architecture, and a lake that looks like the sea. But it carries open wounds that can't be closed with a nice speech or a promotional video. The city's future depends on one simple and difficult thing: bringing the glamour of the waterfront into dialogue with the reality of the Western Corridor and the far South. Because this is the Chicago that doesn't appear in the brochures, full of talent, full of layers, but also full of ghosts that still insist on hanging around the city. So, have you ever stopped to think about this other side of Chicago? The city is still beautiful in the photo, vibrant in summer and full of culture. But behind the reflection in the lake, it has a much more complex history, marked by inequality, debt, and people who insist on resisting. Now tell us, which part surprised you the most? The pension crisis? The neighborhood where life expectancy drops by 20 years in a few blocks? Or the attempt to balance tourism, security, and social dignity? Write in the comments, share the video with anyone who enjoys a good real city story, and of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes. See you at the next stop on our Bello Mundo. See you there.